Thanks, Brenda, and thank you to X-Rite and Moab Paper for having me here today. It's great to be here, and thank you for tuning in to all the viewers out there. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joshua Holko. I'm a full-time nature, landscape, and wilderness photographer, and I specialize in polar and subpolar photography, which means I spend quite a lot of my time, even though I'm based in Australia, in the Arctic, pardon me, in places like Iceland, Greenland, Svalbard, also Antarctica, New Zealand, and even Tasmania, running and leading photography workshops and expeditions, as well as doing my own photography. You can see some of my work at jholko.com. I also run photographyexpeditions.com, and I have a blog, and my blog is probably the best way to stay up to date with what I'm doing at any given point in time or where I might be. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Google+. This is actually a follow-up webinar to one I did earlier this year with X-Rite and Nick Software on processing images with ice and snow. And I had quite a lot of email correspondence after that webinar, just asking if I could perhaps give some more examples of the workflow that I use when processing images with ice and snow, and also if I could talk a little bit about printing images with ice and snow. So it's great to be here today with X-Rite and Moab, and we're going to have a look at processing images with ice and snow, and I'm going to talk briefly about printing them as well as we go along. Before I do that, though, I just want to talk very briefly about a couple of products that I use in my workflow to ensure that I'm getting really good quality images. The first and probably the most important is to actually start with a calibrated monitor. The product that I use to do that is by X-Rite. It's an i1 Display Pro colorimeter, and I use that to calibrate my monitor to a known standard. And I'm going to just show you briefly, I'm not going to do a deep dive on this, but I'm just going to talk and show very briefly what the settings are that I use when I'm calibrating my monitor here in my studio. Now I'm actually using an NEC 27-inch SpectraView monitor, which is a Adobe RGB wide gamut monitor. What that basically means is that it's capable of displaying a larger palette of colors than most monitors. So it's a very, very good choice for working with processing images. If you don't have a SpectraView monitor, you can actually use the software that's provided with the i1 Display Pro to calibrate any monitor, and that's how I use it to calibrate my laptop when I'm traveling in the field. In the case here in my studio, I'm calibrating to a white point of D65 or 6500 degrees Kelvin, a gamma of 2.2, and here's the big one, the brightness or intensity of the monitor. I'm calibrating to 130 candelas, which here in my studio gives me the best possible print to screen paper match. Though that is that the biggest complaint I hear from a lot of people when they first start making pardon me, when they first start making prints is that their prints are too dark. And it's not that their prints are necessarily too dark, it's that their monitor's too bright. So when they have calibrated their monitor, or when they haven't, before they calibrate their monitor and have processed images, quite often they're processed perhaps not optimally because the screen is too bright. And thus when they make a print, there's a very large difference between contrast. So here in my studio, I'm calibrating to 130 candelas, and I'm just using the full color gamut that's available to me in my monitor. And I'm calibrating with the i1 Display Pro roughly every 30 days, just depending on how much work I'm doing here in my studio. But it is something that needs to be done fairly regularly, and as you can see here, there's actually a little nag warning reminding me that it's due again in 22 days' time. The second product that I use in my workflow is also by X-Rite. And I talked very briefly about this in my previous webinar, and I'm just going to go over it again quickly today, and that's the X-Rite ColorChecker Passport. And what the ColorChecker Passport enables me to do, and I'm just going to jump over to Adobe's Lightroom, is actually the ColorChecker Passport is really designed to enable us to create a custom camera profile for our individual cameras. The software I'm going to use today is Adobe's Lightroom for processing images, and inside that is a number of profiles for all the cameras that are supported in this software, and those profiles were created by Adobe with the cameras they had to hand at the time. They weren't created with our cameras. So I like to create my own profile for my specific cameras because it gives me a better color rendering to begin with. It's a very easy product to use. It's supplied with a piece of software. It's actually a plugin that gets installed into Lightroom. And again, just have a look at my previous webinar on exactly how to use it. I'm just going to cover it off again quickly. I have here a photograph of the ColorChecker Passport that I took here in my studio under 5,000 Kelvin lights. It's not actually critical what temperature of light you photograph this under in terms of view of creating a profile. Because I'm not using it for setting a custom white balance, I don't need to be overly stressed about the light that it's shot under. However, it is ISO dependent depending on the camera, so you do need to do this for different ISOs that you may be shooting with. And I'm just going to demonstrate the difference that using a ColorChecker Passport actually makes to the color rendering, because that's what we're really interested in when we create a custom camera profile. If I drop down, I'm in the develop module of Adobe Lightroom at the moment. If I drop down to the very bottom, there's a tab called camera calibration. And this here now is the Adobe standard rendering for the Canon EOS 1DX camera. So the colors that I'm seeing here are as a result of the profile that Adobe use based on their 1DX, not my individual 1DX, EOS 1DX. So I created a custom profile, and I can just jump to that custom profile, and hopefully you can see on screen how much richer the colors become. It's particularly noticeable here in the blues and the reds. And I'm just going to jump back to Adobe standard rendering and the custom profile that I created. And hopefully you can see how much of a difference that actually makes. So applying my custom profile is one of the first things I actually like to do when I start working with my photographs in Lightroom. And I actually always carry a ColorChecker Passport with me into the field, and I quite often will photograph it in the field, just so that I've got images under varying light sources if I do want to use it for setting a white balance. In this case though, in most cases, I'm just using it to set a custom camera profile for color rendering. So let's have a look at processing some images with ice and snow using the ColorChecker Passport. So this iceberg, this incredible triangular shaped iceberg, I photographed in Greenland at a place called Bear Islands about 3 weeks ago. We were out shooting on Zodiacs, just cruising through the fog in this iceberg graveyard, and there are quite a number of spectacular icebergs. And this is one we spent quite a while photographing. And this is the original RAW file shot with the Canon EOS 1DX and the 24-70 f2.8L Mark II lens. Again, just shot from Zodiac handheld. So generally speaking, when I'm working in Lightroom, I have a top to bottom workflow. So I like to start at the top and work my way down. Now it doesn't actually matter whether you do or don't do that, because when you render the file out to a TIFF or a JPEG, Lightroom will actually reorder the adjustments that you make into the correct order to give an optimal result. So you can actually jump around these panels without having to worry about having any sort of effect on image quality. Now, having said I like to work from top to bottom, the very first thing I like to do is to actually come in and set a camera profile, which is the bottom tab. And I'm just going to jump over and set this to the custom profile for my 1DX that I created here in my studio. And hopefully when I do that, you can see just how much richer the blues became in this, pardon me, in the iceberg. I'll just flick it back again to Adobe Standard. So that's the standard rendering for the EOS 1DX that Adobe used. And then the custom profile I created for my own EOS 1DX. Okay, so once I've done that, I'll come back up to the top and I'll quite literally just hit auto. And what auto will do is it will try and optimize the image in terms of view of setting a white point, a black point, so what is going to be the lightest and darkest points in the image, and set a correct exposure and contrast. Now it doesn't always get it right, and in this case it's a little bit overdone and there's a little bit too much contrast there. But it gives me a good starting point. Now the way I like to set these sliders, and the easiest way I find to set them, is to actually hold down the Option key, and I'm going to set the black point first. So if I hold down the Option key and click on the slider, you can actually see as I drag it down, as it starts to clip and continues to clip. So what I'm going to do is just bring that back up until I just have the tiniest little bit of black clipping in my image. About just somewhere in that sort of area there. And I'll do the same for the white point. If I hold down the Option key, this is the easiest way to see when it starts to clip. I can just drag this up, and as you can see, those blue areas are now going to be clipped, which means they're just going to be pure flat white. There's going to be no detail there. So I need to bring those back down until I have just either tiniest little bit or no clipping at all. So just about there. Once I've set my white point and black point, the next thing I like to do is just check my overall exposure. In this case, I'm happy with that. I'm also happy with my contrast setting, but my highlights are actually a little bit hot. Just down in these areas in here, the highlights just a little bit too hot. So what I'm going to do, just zoom back out, is actually just drag down my highlight slider, and that's going to only affect the highlights in the image. And the really great thing about using this slider is that it's actually achieving something that's very difficult to do with a curve. If I were to do this with a curve and just drag down the highlights, what I would end up doing is creating a flat spot on the curve and destroying the tones in that part of the image. So the highlight slider is a very powerful tool when working with images with snow and ice, and it's something that I use a lot. So I'm just going to bring this down to about there. Now once I've set those, I'll then have a look at cropping and white balance. Now white balance for me is a creative tool. What that basically means is that I'm not interested necessarily in what is the correct white balance, but I'm interested in is what is aesthetically pleasing to the eye. If I were to neutralize this by taking the white balance tool and just clicking on this this white patch of ice, what you would find is all the feeling would just go away from the image. That feeling of being cool and cold is completely gone, and it might be technically correct. Pardon me, technically correct. However, it's not aesthetically pleasing. So I'm looking for white balance as a creative tool for me, and I'm just going to just warm this up just a fraction to about there. So again, just a very subtle adjustment, and I don't need to play with the tint in this case. The next thing I like to do is in my own workflow is to set clarity and vibrance. Now clarity is a local contrast, effectively local contrast enhancement. So I have a standard setting that I like to apply of 12 points of clarity to my to my images, and then I'll look at vibrance. Now vibrance is going to saturate the most desaturated colors in an image first. So if you're working with portraiture or skin tones, you can actually pump vibrance up quite a lot before it will start to affect and overly saturate skin. In this case, this image is all about blue, so it's probably going to be the only color in this entire image, so I'm only going to apply my standard 12 points of vibrance, and I almost never use saturation. Saturation is a global adjustment, and it's a bit of a blunt tool for me. I prefer to do any individual channel adjustments later on in my workflow. In this case, I'm not going to make any sort of tone curve adjustment to this image. Occasionally, if an image needs a little bit more contrast, I may do it here in a curve just by applying an S curve to the image. In this case, it's not really required. I'm very happy with the contrast that's there, so I'm just going to get rid of that. And the next thing I'll do is I'll come down to the hue, saturation, and luminance tabs. Now, again, as I mentioned, this image is all about blues. So if I click on the targeted adjustment tool, this little tool here in the corner, I can actually roll over the image, and it will show me what color is in this image. And as I suspected, this image is, no matter where I put the mouse, is all about blue. So I could, if I wanted to, lighten the blue up here and increase the saturation, but I'm actually quite happy with the standard rendering that I've got at the moment. I'll then come down, and at this point I will crop the image. So I'll just hit R for the crop tool, and I'm just going to bring up a little bit here. Also just check my horizon is straight, which it is. Just cropping it a little bit tighter on the image. As you can probably tell, I like to crop in lights out mode. I just find it easier to see what I'm doing. The shortcut key for that is L, or for lights out. After I've cropped the image, I'll then sharpen the image. Now, sharpening and noise reduction are actually interactive, so it is important to know if you are going to need to do some noise reduction, that you really need to work both on noise reduction and sharpening simultaneously because the two are interactive. In this case, this image was shot at ISO 400 on the 1DX, so there's no noise, so there's absolutely no noise at all actually, so there's no reason to apply any noise reduction to this image. What I am going to do though is sharpen it. And the best way, or the way I like to go about sharpening images, is to zoom into 100% and to actually do a before and after. And once I have my before and after set up, I will hold down and I've just chosen this part of the iceberg because there's quite a lot of fine textural detail in here. Once I've zoomed into 100%, I'll hold down the Option key and just drag up the sharpening slider, the amount. And what that's going to do is, holding down the Option key actually shows the image as black and white. And the reason it does that is because sharpening is actually applied to the luminance channel only, not to the color channel. So hopefully as I drag this up, you can actually see the image is getting quite a bit sharper. I'm just going to set that about 50 points. Now, when setting the radius determines how many pixels either side of an edge are actually being sharpened. Now, in the case of images with a lot of high frequency detail, like this piece of ice, so there's a lot of very fine detail in here, you actually want to have a lower radius. So if this was a portrait or of somebody's face, I would want to have a higher radius so that I was not sharpening a lot of the fine detail and pores in their skin. So I'm going to set my radius to, again, about 0.6, which just from experience I know is about right for an image like this with this amount of high frequency detail shot with this particular camera and lens. And then the detail slider, again, I'm just going to hold down the Option key so I can see better what I'm doing and just run this up, again, just to about 50 points. And hopefully you can see now in the before and after on screen, pardon me, how much sharper that actually is. I'll get rid of my before and after and zoom back out. Now, next thing I want to do is, at the moment, this sharpening has been applied globally to this image. So we're sharpening these big areas of fog in here where there's no detail. So I actually want to mask that off. And again, if I hold down the Option key or the Alt key if you're on a PC, I can just drag up my masking to hide areas that I don't want sharpened. And I'm going to set that to about 10 points. So you can see that now that most of the sharpening, set that to 10 points, most of the sharpening is being applied now to the ice and water and not to the sky. I could continue to drag this up. In fact, somewhere around about there might actually be a little bit better, just to mask off that sky area so that sharpening is not being applied to it. Now, I mentioned that there's no need to do any noise reduction to this image. It was shot at ISO 400 on the 1DX. And the last thing I like to do is I like to come down and hit Remove Chromatic Aberration in the Lens Corrections tab. Now, removing CA is very much a free lunch. There's really no negative to doing this, so this lens has almost no chromatic aberration anyway, but it's good practice, I find, to come in here and actually tick this box. Now, once I've done that, I will then come down and have a look at adding a vignette to the image, just to help draw the eye in. And again, I want this to be fairly subtle, so I will set this somewhere around about there, with a midpoint of about 40 pixels. Of 40, sorry. Now, once I've set my my vignette, I'm pretty much done with the image here in Lightroom, and I could now take this image over to Photoshop, where I can do some additional processing. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to take it over into Photoshop. So Photo, Edit in Adobe Photoshop. Actually, just before I do that, I'm just going to show you a little trick I picked up, pardon me, while I was in the Arctic. If you're spotting images here in Lightroom to get rid of dust, one of the easiest things to do to actually see where that dust is, once you've selected the dust tool, is to actually come down to the toolbar and click on Visualize Spots. What that does is it just shows a mask, a temporary mask, to allow you to be better able to see where those dust bunnies are located. And as you can see, there's quite a lot here. I was changing lenses very frequently on Zodiac in the Arctic while I was up there. I was up there for 2 months photographing icebergs, polar bears, some really incredible landscapes in Greenland. So, and during that time, I didn't clean my camera sensors at all. So I've picked up quite a lot of dust. And I'm not going to go through and spot all of these now. I'm just going to pick up the ones that are more prevalent before I jump over to Photoshop to finish this image. And that will probably just about do for the moment. Get these last couple up here. It's a fairly quick process, as you can tell now. Being able to visualize the dust spots makes a fairly big difference to the speed at which you can do this. Okay. Now, I'll take the image over to Photoshop. So Photo, edit in Adobe Photoshop. And I have my settings to bring the file over as a 16-bit TIFF at 300 dpi. And the reason I'm using 300 dpi is that's the recommended resolution for the Canon printers that I'm using, the Canon IPF 6350 and the Canon IPF 8300. Now, this image at the moment has been processed in Adobe Lightroom and is very close to finished, but there is a little bit more that can be done to really bring out texture and tone in this ice. And it's very, very important that we get as much texture and tone into that ice as possible, because when it comes to making a print of this image, if we don't have texture and tone, if we have large flat areas, those are going to print as flat white or very close to white. In this case, a shade of blue, without detail. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of detail in our print. So in order to really maximize what's there, I'm going to use one of the Nik plugins, and I'm going to use ColorFX Pro 4. So to get into that, I go into Filter, Nik Collection, ColorFX Pro 4. You could also get to this directly via Lightroom if you're running the Lightroom plugins as well. This is not the only way to get to these plugins. Okay. Now, I like to work in, here we are in Nik ColorFX. I like to work in a before and after, so with a split screen, so I can drag this line across to see what effect we're having. Now, I'm just going to turn off that standard filter that was the last one I used and come down to tonal contrast. Now, tonal contrast, when I click on this, has a standard default, which I find too strong for almost all my images. So I have a custom created recipe here with all of the settings set to 0. Yes. Okay. So we have a number of different sliders here in tonal contrast that we can use to better enhance this image. And the main one that I'm really interested in is the highlights, because I find that the highlights one is one that has the biggest impact when working with snow and ice. And if I just drag this slider up, you're going to be able to see the difference that's having on this iceberg. And if I drag my before and after over, and again, I just want you to pay particular attention, pardon me, particular attention to this part of the ice here that's bright as I drag this slider over. So there is our before looking a little flat. And then if I drag this back, you can just see we just picked up a lot more texture in there. We could probably actually use a little bit more. So just drag that back. This is before and after. And I'm pretty happy with that setting. I'm just going to have a look at my midtones. And again, I'm just going to set my midtones a little bit more subtly, just down in that area. Before, and this is just a very easy way to see what effect these sliders are actually having on the image, on the individual sections of the image, whether it's the highlights, midtones, or shadows. I don't like to play with saturation here in this plugin. Again, this is a global adjustment, so it's going to affect the entire image. I prefer to do my saturation in individually on an individual channel basis, either in Lightroom or in Photoshop. Now, I could, if I wanted to, in this instance, apply these settings that I've just made, which have been applied globally to the entire image, just to this piece of ice. And the way I would do that is with the control point. So I would come down here, add a control point, drop it on the ice. I can come back over to here and just click on the mask to see what it is that this control point is going to affect. So I want to affect that part of the ice. And I'm now actually only affecting the ice with that control point. I'm not affecting the sky at all. So as you can see, that Sky isn't changing, I'm just affecting the ice. Once I've done that, I'll hit OK. And that will actually apply this effect as a separate layer onto the image. So if I have overdone this effect, I could actually drag back the opacity here in Photoshop. And sometimes I'll deliberately overdo the effect and then we'll choose to set a lower opacity, just depending on the individual image that I'm working with. In this case, I'm just going to click this layer on and off so you can see the effect that nick. And again, just looking particularly in this area in here is having on this photograph. Once I'm done, I'll click Save to actually save the photograph, and then I will be ready to start to make a print. Now, when I'm printing an image like this, I'm usually printing on either Moab Somerset Museum rag or on Entrada rag, both of which are matte papers. I personally have a preference for matte papers when I'm making prints. I find that under glass, gloss papers and luster papers just pick up too much reflection, and if I use a non-reflective glass, it just tends to suck a little bit too much color out of the image and make it lifeless. So I prefer to actually print on matte papers and then put matte papers under glass, which is how I like to present my prints. If I was going to make a print of this image now, the first thing I would like to do is to actually soft proof it. So when I want to soft proof it, I want to basically simulate what this image is going to look like on paper, but before I make a print and spend the money to make on expensive paper and ink. And soft proofing is really actually quite a simple thing to do, but again, it does hinge very much on you having a properly calibrated monitor. That profile that you create for your monitor is really critical to getting good quality prints, as well as the processing of the actual image itself. And I'm going to show now just how I do that, how I soft proof the image. Now, this can actually be done either in Photoshop or in Lightroom. In this case, I think I'll actually do it in Lightroom because it's a little bit easier to demonstrate. So I'm just going to save this file before I close it. And we'll close it and we will go back to Lightroom with our finished processed file. Now, in order to soft proof this image for printing, I need to come down here and click on soft proofing, here in the develop module still. And what that will do is change the background to white, or to the very similar to the paper color. And I will come up here to select the custom profile that I created for Museum Somerset Rag by Moab for my printer. And I will simulate paper and ink color in my soft proof. Now, if I turn this on and off, you'll see a lot of the contrast is actually gone. There's the finished image as processed, and here's the finished image as it's going to be soft proofed. So I'm going to lose quite a bit of color and contrast when I make a print, and that's simply to do with the fact that the paper that I'm using is quite flat, but also because the paper is a reflective surface, whereas the screen is backlit. So we need to compensate for that when we make a print. And the way I like to do that is, once I've got soft proofing selected here, I'll come up to my develop module and I'll do a before and after. So here on the left, I have my image before soft proof. And here on the right, I have the image as it's going to appear on paper. And it's just lacking a little bit of contrast, particularly local contrast, and also a little bit of saturation. So by working here, what I'm trying to do is to achieve the look here on the left on this image on the right. Now, I have some standard things I like to do to an image when I'm preparing it for print. And the first one is to apply some clarity. And clarity again is, yes, I want to create a proof copy. Clarity again is a local contrast adjustment. So what it's going to do is just give the image a little bit more crunch and pop. That some of that had disappeared from being printed on a matte paper. And if I just zoom into this saturated area here, I can see that on the right here, it's a little flat and not quite as saturated. So I'm just going to put in 5 points of saturation. Pardon me. To the image, and I'll also apply a slight curve for contrast, just because the contrast of this paper is not quite going to be what's shown on screen. And once I've got that as a fairly close match, Again, this is very much seasoned to taste, because I'm trying to match this image on the left with the image on the right. And that's looking much, much better. And again, if I just turn this tone curve adjustment on and off, just move back to a single image, turn this contrast adjustment on and off, you can see the contrast that's being added to this image. Okay, at this point I'll be actually ready to make a print, and I will be printing this on the paper that I soft proofed it for, which is Somerset Museum Rag by Moab. And I will now take the image back over to Photoshop, and I want to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments, because I've made some adjustments here to this image. So this is now going to be my print file, and what I need to do at this point is size the image. So I'll come into image, image size. I don't want to resample the image, but I'm going to make a 10-inch print, 10 by 14-inch print on 13 by 19-inch paper, and the native resolution is going to be 331 pixels per inch. Now I generally will not upsample an image unless I'm under 200 ppi. So I've sized the image, and next I need to sharpen the image specifically for print output. We've sharpened the image for screen, but we really need to now sharpen the image for the print. And the way I like to do that is I use a product by PhotoKit, by Pixel Genius, called PhotoKit Output Sharpener. And I'm just going to run that. And up here I can select the output sharpener, which is what I want. I'm sharpening for an inkjet printer on matte paper. This is the print size and resolution. It's very important that image size is set before you run this plugin, because it's going to sharpen the image based on the recommended image size. The image size that I've set. So I'll hit OK. And that image has now been sharpening, and that sharpening has been applied as a separate layer. Now it's going to look overly crunchy on the screen, and that's because it's very difficult to, well, it's more than difficult, it's actually impossible to accurately judge sharpening on screen for the print. And that's got to do with the resolution of the printer versus the resolution of the monitor that I'm working with. Once I've applied my sharpening, I'll then literally take it over to the Canon plugin for my printer, and I'll run through the various settings in the plugin to make a print. Okay, so first thing I need to do is select my media type, which is Moab Somerset Museum Rag paper. I want the highest possible accuracy with the highest gradation. This is the important one. I need to select my custom-made profile, which is the profile that I use to soft proof the image. In this case, I'm going to use relative colorimetric. Perceptual is only something I would use if I was dealing with an image that had a lot of out of gamut color. In this case, I know from experience that this photograph is going to be in gamut, and that relative colorimetric will be the correct choice. I'll then come over here and set my paper size, which is going to be 13 by 19. And my paper choice, which will be manual paper, and I would be ready to make a print of this image. And I'm not going to make a print now, but if I was, I'd just quite literally go through and hit print. So there we have it. That's pretty much my workflow for working with images with snow and ice. What I'm going to do now is come back into Lightroom and just have a look at one more image that's a little bit different, which is this photograph of a polar bear that I shot up in, a large female polar bear that I shot up in on the pack ice at 80 degrees north of Svalbard about 8 weeks ago. This was actually shot with Canon's new 200 to 400 millimeter lens, and it was actually shot through the porthole of the ship that I was on, MS Origo, which is a wonderful ship for photography. The portholes are actually very low to the water, only 50 centimeters above the waterline, which means that once you're in the pack ice, you can open the porthole and quite literally shoot at the same level as the bear, which is just a fantastic place to be for photography. So let's just have a look at processing this image. I'm just going to turn off soft proofing. And again, I'm going to work from top to bottom in terms of view of processing this photograph. Something I didn't talk about with the previous image I just demonstrated is that it's very, very important that you have a good exposure to begin with when you're working with digital files. You want to have an image that has a histogram that is exposed to the right, but not clipped. And the reason you want to do that is that the way the camera's sensor captures data is non-linear. There is a lot more information that's captured in the top 1/3 of the histogram than in the bottom part of the histogram down here. So wherever possible, I'm always trying to expose to the right without blowing any highlights so that I have the most possible ones and zeros to work with later here in my studio. So this image is actually quite a good exposure. It could have actually been pushed to even perhaps a little further to the right, but there's plenty of data here for me to work with. So again, the very first thing I'm going to do here in the develop module of Lightroom is apply my custom profile that I created with the X-Rite ColorChecker Passport for my Canon 1DX. And that's just going to give me a slightly better rendering of color to begin with, and it just saves me time. I want to get the best possible result in the least amount of time when I'm processing my photographs. So by applying this profile, I'm getting richer colors very, very quickly and very, very easily. So I'm just going to go back to standard. And in this case, it's a fairly subtle change, but if you'll notice, particularly in the blues and the reds here, in the dried blood on this bear's face, when I flick over to the custom profile I created for my camera, everything just gets a little bit richer, and I far prefer it. Now, once I've set that, I'll then come back up to the top, and I will again just hit the auto button. And as you can see, auto again is just trying to set the white point and black point for the image, as well as exposure. Now, in this case, it's a little bit too hot, so again, it needs some work to fix it. So what I'm going to do is just set my black point first by holding down the Option or Alt key, Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC. And you can see what's clipping there, just that little bit in the bear's nostrils. And I'm just going to bring that up just a fraction to about there, so that I've got detail here in the nose, but the internal part of the nostrils here are solid black. Then I'm going to set my white point. And as you can see, the standard white point has been set. There's actually quite a lot of clipping. So I'm actually just going to bring that down to get rid of that clipping. Just there. Now, at this point, we have no clipping, but this large area of ice and snow here is just a little bit white and flat looking. So I'm just going to use my highlights tool and just drag that slider down. And as I do, I'll drag it all the way to -100. You'll be able to see how much more texture and tone we've picked up here in this ice and snow. So this is where it was at default. And as I drag it down, and you can see the effect too up here in the histogram that this is having on the histogram, that white point is pinned, but it's dragging the highlights back down here to the left. And again, that's something that's very difficult to do with a curve. So I like to try and use this tool as much as possible. And I'm just going to set it here now to -90. I don't need to make any adjustment to the shadows in this image. If I needed to, I could either lift or darken the shadows, but I'm quite happy with them where they are for now. In terms of white balance, again, at the moment, I shot this on auto white balance. In fact, auto white balance is what I always leave my camera on, because again, white balance for me being a creative tool, it's far more important to set what looks aesthetically pleasing to me, rather than what might be technically correct. And again, I'm just going to demonstrate that. If I take the pardon me, if I take the white balance tool and just click on this snow and ice, it's just going to warm the image up and remove the feeling of being cool. And it was cool when I shot this. It was around 0 degrees. So I'm just going to undo that, and I like to set this manually by eye. And I just find that with the Canon cameras, they are just usually a fraction too cool for my liking. So I'm just going to nudge this up just to about there, to 5938 degrees Kelvin. And that's all I'd like to do in terms of white balance on this image. Next thing I'm going to do is crop it. So now I just go into R. R is the shortcut key for the crop tool. And I like to crop in lights out mode. Lights out being L, the L key. Just because I find it enables me to better see what I'm doing when I'm cropping an image. And I'm just going to crop some of this extraneous area on the left out, and just a little bit of sky as well. Okay. Moving down, I'd like to apply my standard 12 points of clarity, 12 points of vibrance. I find that that's sufficient for the majority of images that I'm working with, because these are global adjustments in terms of your color. So although vibrance is working on the most desaturated colors, it can quite often be that there's desaturated colors in various parts of the image. And if I want to do specific color adjustments, I'll do them down here in the HSL area. Once I've done that, I'm then going to apply a gradient to the sky. So the gradient tool can be accessed over here or by clicking on the M shortcut key. And I'm just going to drag that down to roughly there and just darken the sky a little bit. This was actually shot around midnight, this image, in the Arctic under the midnight sun, so it was still extremely bright. Once I've done that, I will come down to my individual adjustments here. Now I like to use the targeted adjustment tool in the HSL panel here because it gives me control. I can run it over a part of the image to see what color there actually is there. In this case it's pardon me, it's red. So I'm just going to increase the saturation, red and orange. I'm just going to increase the saturation a little bit in that face. Interestingly enough, polar bears are actually yellow. They're not white. You can actually see that here when I put the targeted adjustment tool over the bear. I don't really want to increase the yellow in this case. The fur on this bear is already quite yellow. I'm just going to leave it as it is. But what I am going to do is just lighten this part of the face and the bear. And I'm going to do that with a local adjustment. Local adjustment brush, if I use the K, which is the shortcut button for local adjustment brush, and then I'm going to use O. If I push the O shortcut key, as I start to paint, the area will appear red that I'm painting, so I can see the area that I'm affecting. Now I have my brush set to a flow of 25 because I like to slowly build up the effect rather than have it set to 100. Just by pushing O again, I can hide the painted area. And what I'm going to do is just gently with exposure, just lift that just a little bit so that I can have a better view of the bear's face here. It was a little bit dark before. Once I've done that, I will come down and sharpen the image. And again, when I'm sharpening, I like to do a before and after. And it needs to be done at 100%. You can't judge sharpening at anything other than 100%. So it's very, very important that you do zoom in. And again, I'm going to hold down the Option or the Alt key on a Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac, and just drag up my sharpening slider to somewhere around about there. I just know from experience that roughly 50 points is the right amount for this particular camera and lens. Now I mentioned radius earlier in the previous image. Here we have also a lot of fine textural detail, but rather than being just in the snow and ice, it's also in the fur of the bear. So I'm going to want to set a low radius because I've got a lot of high frequency detail. And we'll just going to set that to again about 0.6. Again, just holding down the Option key, I can actually see the result that I'm getting. And again, I'm going to drag up my detail slider just to help bring out the hairs in that bear's fur. Once I've done that, I can get rid of my before and after, zoom back out, and then mask off areas that I don't want to have that sharpening applied to, such as these large areas of sky. So I'll just drag up my radius to about there, a little bit lower than that. Just check that. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Okay, again, this image was shot at ISO 400 on the EOS 1DX, so there's no noise reduction required. But what I will do again is just remove any CA. Now, the lens I shot this with, the new 200-400, has virtually no CA, even at 300% magnification. It's an incredibly good lens. But as it's a free lunch, there's nothing detrimental that can be done to the image by clicking this. I'll always tick this box. Once I've done that, I'm pretty much finished with the image here in Lightroom. In this case, although there might be a temptation to apply a vignette to this image, I'm not going to do that because if I do, this snow and ice will start to look unnaturally dark. and I like the way the light falls very softly here with the shadow under the midnight sun, so I don't want to destroy that. What I do want to do though is see if I can extract a little bit more in the way of detail in these areas here, so that when I make a print on my Moab paper, I'm going to get really nice detail right through this snow and ice, and also up here in the fur of the bear. So I'm going to use the same technique I used before. I'm going to take it over to Photoshop. Just waiting for the image to load up. And I'll take it into Filter, Nik Collection, Color Effects Pro 4. And again, I like to do my before and after slider so that I can see the effect that I'm having. Just set that back to 0. Okay, so here we are. We've applied the tonal contrast, and again, I'm just going to drag up. This is at 0 at the moment. I'm just going to drag up my highlights so that you can see how quickly this has an effect. Now, I've overdone the effect here just for so that you can see as I do a wipe across with a before and an after. So that's obviously too much. I'm just going to bring this down because I really just want to bring out detail, some detail in this foreground. Again, this is about being subtle. I don't want to overdo this effect. Something in that sort of area. And I'm also going to leave that little bit of mid-tone there because I probably find that's affecting this area in here under the bear's arm. So if I just drag that up, yeah, it is. I don't want to overdo that. It's going to create too much contrast. So I'm just going to leave that, again, fairly subtly set. And I don't want to apply anything to my shadows or any saturation here. And I'll click OK. And as you can tell, once you've done this a few times, you get really, really fast at it. And I'll generally, when I'm processing an image like this, it doesn't usually take me any longer than about 5 minutes. From the time I import the raw file to the time I actually have a finished file ready for print. Sometimes it takes me a little bit longer, just depending on what, if I have a difficult file, something I can't make a decision on. It can be a little bit of an iterative process at times, but generally it's fairly quick. Here, now we've got our finished photograph of a bear. I can save this image, close this, take it back over to Lightroom, where I can soft proof the image now ready for print. And again, it's just updating now in Lightroom with the revised image. So I'm going to soft proof this image to make a print. And again, I'm going to print on Moab Somerset Museum rag. And I'm going to use the relative colorimetric rendering intent because I know that I don't have anything that's going to be out of gamut. I can actually check that by clicking on this little button up here on the histogram, which actually will show me if anything had been out of gamut. But in this case, there's nothing out of gamut. If I flick to the perceptual rendering intent, it's very, very similar. Perceptual is just going to map any colors that were out of gamut into gamut, but it does that by moving all the colors that are in gamut as well. If I was to print this image in relative colorimetric, and if there were colors that were out of gamut, those colors would simply get chopped off, so they wouldn't be printed by the printer. So I'm going to soft proof it in for relative colorimetric, which is how I'm going to print it. And again, I'm going to do a before and after. And hopefully you can see here, I've just lost a little bit of contrast here in my proof. Here's my original file on the left. Here's what the file is actually going to look like as a print on the right. So I like to just, again, apply a little bit of clarity, just 10 points of clarity, 5 create a proof copy, 5 points of saturation, just to bring back that saturation that's going to be lost on the matte paper. And again, I'll just apply a curves adjustment just because I want to pick up a little bit of contrast. And this is not an exact science. It's very much about getting a feel for it. So there'll be before my curves adjustment and after my curves adjustment. And you can probably tell the image just got quite a little bit brighter. And that's because the image is going to print a little bit down being on a matte paper. So I just want to correct for that with a curves adjustment. And once I've done that, I am ready to take the image, get rid of my before and after, take the image back over to Photoshop, edit in Photoshop. I'll edit a copy with the adjustments I just made for print. And I'll size the image size. Again, I'm going to make a 10-inch print, 10 by 14.7. It'll be at 316.9 pixels per inch. I'm not resampling the image at all. Click OK. And then I'll need to sharpen the image for the print. So File, Automate. Again, I'm using PhotoKit's Output Sharpener. Printing this on Moab Somerset Museum rag. So it's an inkjet output sharpener. It's a matte paper. I'll click OK. And that will then apply the correct sharpening for this image at that size on this particular matte paper. And I can then go into the Canon dialog and make a print like I did before. So that's how I process images and print my photographs with snow and ice. I hope this has been of some use and that you've enjoyed it. If anyone has any queries, feel free to drop me an email at any time. My email is info@jholko.com. And if I'm here and not traveling, I'll generally be able to get back to you fairly quickly. If I'm traveling, you just have to bear with me, but I will get back to you. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being here today. Thank you to X-Rite and Moab, and I look forward to working with both in the future. Thank you.